Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on what time you're watching this. My name's Connor from 905 Review. You guys are checking out our series Give This a Spin, where I recommend you one of my favorite albums. And here we have the delightful classic that is Talking Heads' 1980 release, Remain in Light. Talking Heads were an odd bunch formed in New York in the mid-70s, and really they were hot stuff, as every label wanted to sign them just after a couple shows at the famed CBGB in Manhattan. Sire wound up being the one that secured their rights, and really it worked out pretty well for them, as one of Talking Heads' first recorded songs, Psycho Killer, would go on to be one of their biggest hits from their semi-self-titled debut. Following this, they teamed up with the legendary and forever underrated Brian Eno to produce their next two albums, and two great ones at that. During this time, he really encouraged them to utilize more funk sound as well as world music, being sound and styles more typical of countries outside of the Western continents, in this case African territory. Talking Heads and Brian Eno were truly a stylistic match made in heaven, only things weren't always smooth sailing. Following the release of their album Fear of Music, Talking Heads frontman David Byrne and Brian Eno went off to do their own thing, while bassist Tina Weymouth and drummer Chris Frantz, who were married by the way, debated on whether to continue on with the band, as Weymouth felt that Byrne was too controlling. After a vacation to the Caribbean to mull things over, and which likely only added to their vast palette of musical influence, they opted to stick with it. Byrne was also struggling as the lead writer for the band, suffering from writer's block, so in a change that worked for everybody, this time, as opposed to how they previously operated, they would come up with all the music first, just going on these long, extensive jams, finding which parts they liked and kind of making a rhythm out of that. And then they just let him add in his own words on top of it afterwards. Now they just had to get Brian Eno back on board, except he was kind of on the fence about making another album with them, except once he heard what the group had been working on at this time, he was all in. So let's see if we're in the same boat. Perfect segue into the music, starting with Born Under Punches. Their unconventional, intricate, funky sound is heard right from the get-go here.
Take a look at these hands. The hands beats. The hand never coming in there.
While you try to figure out how to dance to this, or maybe you don't even have to think, it's very much interpretive dance territory. David Byrne sounds off about the government, how they're always doing stuff to keep us common folk down. And I mean, consider the time this album came out. One of America's most controversial decades had just ended, with the resignations of Spiro Agnew, Wilbur Mills, and obviously Richard Nixon. And Byrne points out that all of us everyday people, man, all we want to do is breathe. And they even got to make stuff like that hard on us, right? Because the heat goes on. Following this then is Cross-Eyed and Painless, in which Byrne describes losing oneself.
Lost my shape. Trying to act casual. Can't stop.
What more there is to this is unclear, but based on my studies of the album, I wouldn't be surprised if he's just airing out his frustrations of trying a stylistic change in terms of writing music. What we do know for sure is that he doesn't like facts. They're just the be-all, end-all. There's no fun there. There's no creativity or mystery or opportunity for, theories and deep thinking. It's just so bland, so to the point. Already ending the first album side, but with some fast grooving authority, we have The Great Curve. There's an undistinguished she that Byrne mentions throughout the song, and I'm under the impression that she is our fate or destiny, considering he says she moves to describe the world, she has messages for everyone, and she guides with invisible hands. And while people across the world have different ways of treating each other, She loves us all. Maybe she's even supposed to be God. Now, it can be hard focusing when there's 3 people simultaneously singing different things, but whether you can pick up on more than one at a time or not, it still just sounds so appealing and goes so well with this fast-paced groove. The song also features 2 killer machine drill-like guitar solos. This is the best song on the album, and you can't convince me otherwise. As a matter of fact, it might even be my #1 Talking Heads song of all time. And so, opening the album's second side is its big hit, Once in a Lifetime. While it had been speculated the song might be referring to the greed we find ourselves chasing in this consumerist upbringing, it's actually much simpler than that. It's about how, for so much of your life, you're just going through the motions. Even if you just think of like your drive to work, you might mostly just be on autopilot for it, right? This is just about taking that step back, reflecting on where you are and how the path you took got you here, and just enjoying that. Maybe you've got a beautiful wife, maybe you've got a car you really enjoy, or maybe you've just got this great place that you reside.
And you may ask yourself, well, how did I get here? Letting the days go by, let the water hold me down. Letting the days go by.
Brian Eno wasn't even crazy about the song, so it almost didn't even make the cut onto the album. And another quick anecdote is that apparently this was broadcast on the very first day MTV was running. The more you know. We keep that funk running on the 5th track here, Houses in Motion. And I feel like this one actually is a commentary on chasing money and possessions. David knows he's a good guy and he doesn't need any of that stuff, and that's why he's able to lead such a happy life. These other guys, however, they'll be grinding their whole lives because they never spent a second to really appreciate things. They just started digging and continued digging until they dug themselves their own grave because that's all they ever did was dig.
Can't afford to stop. That is what you believe. He'll keep on digging for 1,000 years.
So Burns fine doing his own thing without the need of a big fancy house, and you know what, with the Canadian housing market what it is right now, I hear you, pal. This brings us to the somewhat laid back seen and not seen. Byrne goes on to describe someone who takes influence from others to kind of leech off their personality or image. The concerning part about this is that eventually you might become someone else entirely, or even if you have second thoughts halfway through, you might have already lost yourself. While it's an important message, I want to say this is the weakest song on the album to me. It feels like there isn't enough going on, which admittedly doesn't even sound very accurate because there is a decent amount going on, but it just seems like there's no real focal point. It's almost like everything's just in the background.
He would see faces in movies, on TV, in magazines, and in books. He thought that some of these faces might be right for him.
After this is Listening Wind, and wow, what a revelation studying an album is. The only lyrics that ever previously stuck with me were the chorus, and with the song being emotional, kind of melancholy, I always just thought this was a good, like, nighttime cruising tune.
The wind in my heart, the wind in my heart, dust in my head.
Come to find out, it's actually about someone in a foreign land that American troops have come to liberate or occupy, and this person plans to bomb them. And it makes for pretty tricky subject matter. You can absolutely question the validity of some of the places American troops have been deployed, but it's also so interesting to hear the story being told from the other side's perspective.
Holds the package in his quivering hands.
At the same time, I don't condemn it by any means though, because it is important to remember that there's multiple sides to every conflict, and odds are you're actually not always the good guy. Burns' comment on the number of Americans who don't realize they aren't universally loved is pretty brilliant though. Still a great tune, and I want to call it underrated, but to be honest, I've never really had many people to talk to about Talking Heads outside of just the singles that the majority of people know. And we close out the album now with The Overload. It's quite different. It's more of this eerie, ambient kind of piece. Supposedly, it's the band's attempt at a Joy Division-like song, despite the fact none of them had ever listened to Joy Division. Even still, they really aren't that far off, especially if they're just going based on a verbal comparison, because I'd say it's fairly similar to I Remember Nothing, the closing track off of Unknown Pleasures.
Trapped in a cage and surrendered too soon.
Remain in Light is available on cassette, CD, vinyl, and digital download, and I'm honestly surprised at how few special variants there are of this album. There's been a couple limited edition numbered runs, but without really any aesthetic changes. Aside from that, there was red transparent vinyls put out in 2018, white vinyls put out in 2022, and in 2006 there was a CD-DVD set that contained outtakes and live performances of Once in a Lifetime and Cross-Eyed and Painless. The album originally had the working title of Melody Attack, for which this artwork was designed, but this was eventually saved just to be the back cover once it was changed to Remain in Light, featuring an equally iconic art. If you need any more reason to check out this album, I mean, just look at these ratings. Isn't this insane? 10s across the board. It's universally loved and praised for all the different directions they took and could forge into one condensed sound. If you were to look at a list of the best albums from 1980, the 80s as a decade, or even of all time, odds are Remain in Light would show up on there, and perhaps relatively high. It even ranked 39th on Rolling Stone's Top 500 Albums of All Time list, and it's been certified gold in the US, UK, and Canada. With multiple fantastic albums, it can be pretty challenging to pick which Talking Heads released is best, though this is probably often considered their best, and it's not too hard to see why. The release is so awesomely rhythmic and funky, and so for me this is a pretty easy A. I mean, you saw everybody else's ratings. I'm right there with them. Realistically, Seen and Not Seen is the only song on here that I don't listen to regularly, and the rest of the album makes up some of the band's best material. Those have been my thoughts on Talking Heads and Remain in Light. Let me know yours. And as always, it's been about... I can't believe I messed that up. It's been a pleasure hosting you. But, real quick, before we take off, I'm asking you what your thoughts on Remain in Light were. Did I rate it too high? Did I rate it too low? You let me know down below, as well as any other comments you might have. I check them all, and maybe you'll check out all my videos as a result. Appreciate it. Thanks.